Good afternoon and welcome to the Southern Fire Exchange webinar series. I'm Adam Watts from University of Florida, and I'll be talking to you this afternoon about wildfire effects on forest structure and soils in Big Cypress National Preserve, Florida. So one of the things that I find interesting and intriguing about fires in wetlands is that initially it sort of seems that they should not occur. Fire in wetlands seems to be almost oxymoronic. But as all of you in the audience know, and anyone who's worked with fire for very long knows, fire does occur in wetlands and it can be a very important ecological factor in them. And so I'll talk today about some of the research I did in my dissertation looking at wetland fire ecology in an area in southern Florida, Big Cypress National Preserve. This just happens to be one of many places where it really seems ideal to do wetland fire ecology research projects. Big Cypress National Preserve is a really large area of real estate. It's about 750,000 acres adjacent to Everglades National Park. And it comprises a range of habitat types, going from on the southwestern fringe, you have mangrove coastline, all the way over to the Everglades on its eastern border and the sawgrass prairies that you have there. Up along the northern side, you can see that splash of green. It's a lot of tropical hardwood hammocks and oak hammocks. But the central portion of the preserve is dominated by pine uplands, such as pine rocklands and pine flatwoods, as well as cypress swamps, from which it gets its name. And Big Cypress National Preserve also has the largest prescribed burn program in the National Park Service, sometimes rivaled by Everglades. But in combination with the seasonal lightning storms, there are a lot of acres burned every year. There's still plenty of room for wildfires to occur. And one of the things that's notable about the region is that there's a very strong seasonal precipitation distribution, strong rainy versus dry seasons. And that's illustrated by this hydrograph here. You can see the red line representing a typical soil elevation. That's feet above sea level there. And as you go through time from this graph in 2007 through 2010 almost, you can just see how the water levels in this particular location are rising and falling. They'll rise above the soil surface beginning in midsummer due to the seasonal rains, and then those occur for a few months, and then the water levels start to decrease. And one example of a really long and severe dry season is in 2009, when from about January or even late 2008, there was very little to no precipitation. And you can actually see where the hydrograph dropped off the map here. And because those dry season to wet season transitions occur with the arrival of these big thunderstorms, you often have lightning to ignite wildfires. And this is what happened in 2009. Lightning initiated a very large wildfire called the Deep Fire. Right there, April 22nd, you can see that red arrow representing ignition right there. And one notable feature about this fire was that it was very extensive. Within the burn perimeter, almost every square inch of that burn perimeter was charred in some way, was affected. Even the wetlands and marshlands and tropical hardwood hammocks, which are normally quite fire resistant, had dried out to such an extent that they were susceptible to fire then. This is an area where that fire occurred. It's in the northwestern portion of the preserve there, and you can see the official map prepared by Mindy of Big Cypress National Preserve, describing the fire perimeter. It was approximately 28,000 acres, maybe a little bit more when the final size up was done. And if you look kind of closely in the central area of that perimeter and to its right, you can see this type of landscape, this mosaic comprised of these small round gray features in a green matrix. And the green matrix is, in most of these cases, pine flatwoods or transitional pine rockland, basically a pine-dominated, fire-maintained uplands type of ecosystem. And as you zoom in, especially if you fly over the preserve, you can see that those gray roundish patches are what turn out to be called Cypress domes. Many of you in the southeast are familiar with this term, but dome simply describes the profile of the dome when it's viewed obliquely. That's a phenomenon, of course, caused by the trees not being quite as tall at the edges as they are in the exterior. And in this image, you can see that these cypress domes really occur for as far as the eye can see. And they're a major, obviously, feature across the landscape. And it was for that reason that we were concerned about what the deep fire could do and what some of the effects of that deep fire might be. So that's our first study that I'll talk about, is wildfire effects on forest structure in these cypress domes. So what we did in this study was we took a look within the fire perimeter and we identified all the cypress domes, and we randomly picked 25 of them. And in each of those domes, which ranged from, again, just a couple of acres up to several acres in size, we looked at burn severity both at the edges and at the interior so that we could get a picture of what the fire was doing in two different places at least. And we also established a strip plot where we censused mortality among the cypress trees. So we did this within a couple of months after the fire so we could capture initial mortality. And then we came back a year later and then 2 years later and looked at the delayed mortality. Something that was kind of interesting, right after the fire, all but just a handful of the trees leafed out again. It looked like they were fine, and that was really surprising because it began to look like maybe even this really severe looking fire hadn't done much to the cypress populations. But it wasn't until a year after the fire that we saw a pretty substantial mortality. We're looking at about 24% mortality overall after 1 year. And just to follow up with the second year, the 2-year post-fire, only a handful of additional trees died. So we had a big pulse of mortality 1 year post-fire, and it looks like that's about all that's going to happen as a result of the deep fire. Talking a little bit about the severity measurements, you can predict, from landscape ecology theory that on the edges of these patches, which are adjacent to drier areas, a lot of times there would be sawgrass or sometimes pine flatwoods, areas with a lot of readily available fuels, that you might see some higher burn severities at the edges as compared to the interiors, which you can just walk into these even during a drought and you can kind of feel that it tends to be cooler, the soil tends to be a little bit moister. And that's what we saw. Overall, this measurement of fire severity that we used, the CBI, or the Composite Burn Index, which ranges from 0 to 3, which 3 would be a very severe fire, we saw a significantly higher burn severity at the edges, 2.1, compared to the center of the domes, which is about 1.6. And you can decompose this CBI into overstory as well as understory fuel strata. And so we saw a severity much higher, or significantly higher, at the exteriors compared to the interiors for both of those. Now, getting back to the mortality of the cypress trees, we also we constructed a mortality probability model, looking at all the different ecological factors which we thought could be at play. So we looked at tree size, we looked at tree density, we looked at distance from the edge going into the interior of these cypress domes. We looked at cypress dome size. One of the things we looked at was even the number of air plants or tillandsia that we have hanging off of the trunks of these trees. We thought that could be a factor as well. And in the end, there were only 2 factors that turned out to be reliable predictors of mortality following this fire. Tree size, which is pretty standard and predictable for a lot of folks who think about fire mortality, and also hydrology, which was a little bit counterintuitive. So if you look down here, these are just some statistics describing these probabilistic models that we constructed. You can, depending on whether you like AIC or ROC over here on the right, which are just different ways of evaluating models, either height or diameter at breast height are 2 two important factors in predicting mortality. Bigger trees tended to do better following the fire. But soil elevation, in other words, the height of the soil corresponding to the hydro period right around the base of the tree, was also a significant predictor of mortality. That was a little bit of a surprise. It turns out that trees that occurred at lower places on the landscape actually tended to experience a little bit higher mortality compared to those that were a little bit higher in elevation. And to give you an idea, if you think back to that photo, Big Cypress, the whole region is a very flat, low relief region. And so when we talk about soil elevation, we're typically talking about just the small depressions that occur only maybe a meter or so, maybe a couple of meters between the highest and the lowest points on the landscape in any given area. So here's just another aerial view of the cypress domes juxtaposed with these frequently burned pine uplands. In this case, I think it's transitional pine rocklands, you'd call it. And this is just to illustrate that you can really easily see the larger trees in the center versus the smaller trees toward the edge. Those are sometimes called bonsai or hat-rack cypress. And one thing that we noticed when we started taking a look at the mortality patterns and what happened post-fire and the structure of the trees was that out toward the edges, the smaller trees tend to resprout more readily following the fire, or they tend to be more likely to be killed outright. And so you tended to get a lot of top kill as a result of the fire. However, as you go toward the center of the cypress dome, those smaller trees, which tend to survive the fire less well than the bigger trees, tend to get killed off. And so what happened is if you compare the size of the trees that were alive before the fire to the trees that were alive after the fire, you get a change in average height. And that change in height actually decreases for live trees following the fire due to top kill at the edges. But the average live tree size actually increases toward the interior. And so we had known, based on a lot of prior studies, that hydrology and soils tends to affect the size of cypress trees in these structures. But this, as far as I know, is the first time that anyone's actually been able to quantify the influence of fire on the structure of cypress domes. So that was a neat little finding that we're able to contribute based on this fire study at Big Cypress. And of course, down in Big Cypress, there are a lot of smaller cypress swamps there, these cypress domes, and small patches of cypress that occur and can experience fire do occur throughout the southeast. So I'm not sure it's fair to say that these findings are applicable throughout the entire range of bald cypress and pond cypress. But if you're a manager and you have these particularly smaller, periodically dry cypress swamps that may experience fire, that could be a factor that contributes somewhat to their structure. So that may be something to be interested in throughout the region as well as just South Florida. So after talking a little bit about the structure effects of fire in cypress, we're ready for our first quiz just to keep everyone awake. So I'll turn it back over to Alan for a second.
All right. So the question, just to kind of lead into this second part of what Adam's going to talk about, is our curiosity for you as to whether or not your operations, your particular area, your responsibilities, how problematic are ground and smoldering fires to you. If you click on one of those buttons on the left and you decide you really wanted to click on another one, just click on the correct one and the wrong one will go away. Wouldn't it be nice if all the wrong answers that we had could go away so easily? All right, well, it looks to me, Adam, like about half it's a severe problem, and for most of our audience, evidently wetlands are a critical issue in their areas of responsibility, which is probably why they're tuned into this. So thank you all very much. Annie, let's go ahead and close that and give it back to Adam.
Well, thanks. Yeah, that's actually really interesting to see. I guess it's may be part of the reason why a lot of you have joined us today. And that's the second half of the presentation today is on smoldering combustion, or how I like to think of it as wildfire in slow motion. Although there are some people who don't seem to notice the preponderance of smoldering fires that tend to happen. The media definitely have picked up on some of these lately, even though smoldering fires don't tend to garner the same kind of media attention as a 747 dropping fire retardant. There have been a lot of headlines describing these fires that occur from the tundra to the tropics. And that was one of the reasons that I became interested in smoldering combustion in Big Cypress. There are a lot of air quality concerns that happen as a result of ground fires. As we know, unfortunately, too well here in Florida, there are a lot of motorist safety concerns that happen as well when these persistent fires that generate smoke 24 hours a day occur near heavily traveled roadways. That's one very unfortunate consequence of these, and there are also obviously the global impacts of them as well. So thinking about these cypress domes down in the preserve, this is a typical view during the rainy season of one of these small cypress patches. You can note one thing is the relatively small tree size here. This is a highly oligotrophic environment. You can also see these bromeliads that I was talking about earlier. But during a fairly severe drought, you can also see that the centers of these cypress domes tend to accumulate lots of duff, lots of down woody debris, and this, when they dry, it tends to be a very receptive fuel bed for embers or for flames that arrive from the outside. And one of the characteristics of these cypress domes is they tend to be dome-shaped in structure above, but that mirrors a kind of bowl shape in the landscape. They occur in South Florida at least, and throughout a lot of Florida, in shallow depressions in the landscape. So here's a representation of that. There's a kind of a dissolution feature, or a sinkhole or incipient sinkhole in the landscape here in the limestone bedrock. And that tends to accumulate sediment. And what this graphic doesn't show is a thick layer of highly organic soil. Depending on your soil's background, you may call it muck or peat or fibric peat. I'll just stick with the catchphrase peat here. But during severe drawdowns and concomitant wildfires, you can have these peat fires to occur in these cypress domes. And that's exactly what we saw both in 2009 and also last year in 2011 with this fire known as the Jarhead Fire. And there was persistent smoldering combustion in these cypress domes, a lot of soil loss. And while it's difficult to quantify those, we were really interested in some of the factors that caused and promoted this smoldering combustion to occur. So in this study, we were interested in some of the influences of soil moisture and also soil organic content on smoldering combustion in these cypress swamps. And because of the changes in fire severity, depending on whether you were at the edge of the cypress dome or toward its center, I was interested in whether there was a relationship between the landscape position and either moisture or organic content in these soils. We predicted there to be an increase in soil moisture and organic content toward the patch centers. And I was also interested in what potential carbon release could occur should there be an extensive smoldering fire. So I'll just describe a few of the results that we got here today. This was primarily a lab-based study. We had set up and had hoped to do a field-based study where we actually set a cypress dome on fire and allowed it to smolder. That would have been a really great way to get a handle on some features of smoldering fires that lab studies can't accomplish. Unfortunately, the conditions for smoldering were a little bit too good, and due to that Jarhead fire that I mentioned last year, we were unable to do that. So instead, the kind of industry standard for these studies is to collect what are called monoliths, these monolithic samples, and to bring them back to the lab. wrap them in insulation, and set them on fire. Methods for this vary, but we used a charcoal grill igniter. And these things that look like gigantic sushi rolls are sitting out here in the yard of the research building. And so we set a number of them on fire to look at the depth of burn and carbon loss. And we also got a lot more samples to look at the effects of landscape position and moisture or organic content. Also, to try and get a handle on what the landscape carbon release potential might be, we looked at 3 different areas within Big Cypress that had different densities and different types of these depressions that contain peat or high organic matter soils. So just going from left to right, this is an area with more of a graminoid marsh. In the center, this kind of represents the lowest density of cypress domes, and on the right here, this is kind of a moderate to moderate high patterning of cypress domes in that landscape. So we thought that that would represent kind of a nice range of variability in this landscape. So to kind of recap what we found for depth versus soil moisture and organic content and mineral content, we saw quite a range in moisture content depending on the depth of soil profile. We saw a good range as well of mineral content, and not so much of a range in organic content. We saw very little correlation in soil moisture between the upper and middle 10 centimeters. We stratified these samples into 3 layers. And we did see a strong correlation between the middle and lower layers. So what that tells us is probably due to the high density of roots in the upper 10 centimeters of the soil. When you do have a drawdown, that upper layer, it can dry out relatively quickly compared to the deeper layers. You'd also expect that due to the insulation, the moisture insulation that happens there as well. Something that was interesting, though, is we didn't see any of these factors or any of the other things that we measured being predictive of post-fire changes in the soil surface. One of the things that is common to measure in these types of studies is the so-called depth of burn, or DOB. And try as we might, we didn't find the same kinds of correlations that other studies have found. And part of the reason for that is probably that depth of burn tends to be very problematic and difficult to measure. What we did see were soil organic carbon consumption in relation to soil moisture. So this is a graphic that just represents the model that we found relating soil moisture, again, in that upper 10 centimeters of soil compared to the carbon loss in the sample. And you can see based on these 4 colors here that adding the second layer, that actually should say 11 to 20 centimeters in that legend there, that improves the model a little bit, but mainly the organic carbon loss in the sample was primarily predicted based on the moisture content in the upper 10 centimeters of the soil. So you can see our moisture contents here ranging from under 100% up to close to 200%. There should be another sample that's beyond 200%. I think we had one sample that sustained smoldering at over 250%, which was quite surprising. We did look at, again, the distance from edge going into the interior and how soil moisture, kind of a snapshot look at soil moisture might differ. We did see a weak relationship. You can see this equation here on the right of this graphic. As you go in, for every meter that you go in from the edge of this cypress swamp toward the centers of it, you gain about 1 1/3% in soil moisture. So that does make a difference. But there's no effect on organic content. We thought that there might be based on different decomposition rates or different levels of nutrients, but we didn't see that. When we did try and extrapolate these models out to the landscape scale, we looked at the number and area of the cypress domes as a proxy for the existence of these organic soils. And we also looked at the moisture contents and the change in organic content in the soils post-fire as a way of predicting basically what kind of carbon loss you could see to the atmosphere if you were to have a fire under fairly moderate soil moisture conditions in these types of landscape blocks. So in order to do this, the moisture contents that I used were kind of mid-dry season. I believe the moisture samples that we got were taken about 2 months before this major fire that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And so that gives you an indication that the landscape can dry out a good deal more before you have a fire. So these are probably fairly conservative numbers. And one of the things that we found when we looked around at other studies looking at carbon loss is one of the most famous of these studies took place following these 1997 fires in Indonesia in this region called Kalimantan. And the estimates that we made based on this study were that even though it's a much smaller landscape extent in Big Cypress Preserve compared to Indonesia, and the peats are a lot shallower in Big Cypress compared to this region, the estimates that we got from this conservative scaling up approach indicate that you might actually have a greater amount of carbon released per meter in these cypress swamp fires compared to these tropical peat fires. So that was just a rough estimate, kind of a rough draft study, if you will, but that indicates that these may be really significant in terms of their global impact if they occur at large spatial extents. Another kind of take-home message from the study is that it appears that organic carbon loss may be a little bit better to look at compared to depth of burn when you're looking at smoldering, especially in these cypress peats. Another surprising study is that we did see a really surprisingly high moisture content in a couple of samples that sustained smoldering combustion. A lot of you who are managers probably know this already, that cypress peats can burn when they're really surprisingly wet feeling, but this just kind of underlined that and documented it. And finally, going back to the first study, one of the take-home messages is that fire does seem to be an important factor in shaping the structure of cypress domes. One of the obviously interesting things about measuring depth of burn, however, and something to keep in mind for the future, is that it can have a big impact on hydrology. This is an area that was burned over the period of a few months in northern Florida. And again, this is a really low relief, dried out marsh or wet prairie. And you can see here there's probably 20 to 30 centimeters of elevation change, which is going to result in a significant change to the local hydro period right here. So you're going to have some vegetation change. And if you're looking across at a landscape, that could have impacts on the availability of open water habitat for prey items, for wading birds. It could have effects on the availability of watering holes for wildlife as well. So that's one additional thing to be interested when you're considering smoldering combustion, is there could be some ecological benefits that we don't really know about in terms of wildlife that are going to be important in looking at. So while we definitely have some human costs and some serious air quality and global, probably global climate change concerns related to these fires, there are probably some other factors as well that we should document so that in the future, as we make decisions, we have a little bit better idea of what the cost benefit is. So before we turn it over to the audience, I'd really be interested in getting some discussion going. I would like to put in a couple of plugs for upcoming conferences. As Alan mentioned, the International Conference on Fire Behavior and Fuels Management will be in Raleigh, North Carolina in February of next year. This is going to be a great event for the Southeast. Another area geographically where a lot of smoldering combustion research has been done is the Pocosin ecosystems in that state. So there will be some field trips in the area, and that'll be a great conference. Another conference that's coming up closer but is a little bit further away is the International Fire Ecology and Management Congress put on the Association for Fire Ecology in Portland, Oregon. And down here you'll see a link to that conference as well if you're interested. So again, I'd really like to thank you. This is my first webinar, so I hope that it's been a useful experience for you. I hope that you'll consider completing the short survey that Annie and Alan will email to you. Um, Here are some links. I hope that you can move your mouse to some of these links and click on them to find some additional resources. There are a couple of articles on the studies that I mentioned, and there are also some links to the Southern Fire Exchange website and a couple of ways to stay in touch with SFE. And if you've got any feedback or questions that you think of after the webinar, either for me or for ways to improve the webinars, we'd appreciate it if you'd send those to those email addresses at the bottom of the page here. So once again, thanks a lot, and I'll turn it over, I guess, to Alan to moderate if anyone has any discussion points or questions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Adam, for a very enlightening and great discussion of the research you've done. And I've got a leading question, but first let me find out if anybody else has questions. And if you can enter them in the chat box, that would be very helpful, and we'll try to grab those in the order that they come in. And just another reminder, as Adam said, we will be sending an email out to you probably in the next 24 to 48 hours just with a couple 30-second questions about the webinar today and your evaluation of it. And we would welcome that feedback from you, as we intend to have a lot more of these. Some of you or all of you may be aware that there's already a lot of fire webinars available through the Wildfire Lessons Learned Center and the North Carolina State Webinar Portal, and we've worked with them in the past. It's just one more opportunity that we have doing it right at home here. So I see a couple people typing some questions. Let me throw one out to you, Adam, just real quickly, and see at the same time as you were studying those, to the north of us in the Okefenokee, there have obviously been 2 years of huge fires that have smoldered and burned across a lot of. Has there been any information come out of those yet that would relate to what you were studying and that might contribute to the results that you have?
I wish there were, and if anyone who's in the webinar now knows of results or knows of ongoing research projects in the Okefenokee, I would really appreciate knowing about them. Try as I might, unfortunately, I just could not find anyone who's doing work there. The Okefenokee, compared to Big Cypress, was a huge ongoing fire for a very long time. I think it may now set the record for the longest burning wildfire in U.S. history, or close to it. I've seen some anecdotal reports of many feet of consumption of peat and organic soil, but unfortunately, I think unless we do some kind of remote sensing analysis, I don't know of anyone who's on the ground doing studies there.
Okay. I'm sure that there are, but they evidently haven't come out yet. Mindy has a question. Considering that average tree height in dome interiors increased 2-year post-fire, would it be fair to say that fire in a dome's interior generally does not impact the normal growth that would occur in the interior without fire?
Thanks for the question. I think this might be Mindy Wright. If that's Mindy Wright, you saw her map of the deep fire extent on, I think it was about the 6th or 7th slide of the deep fire. I just want to make sure that I understand the question right. Fire does not impact the normal growth that would occur in the interior. I think it's fair to say that it should not impact the normal growth that would occur in the interior. I've seen a couple of studies that look at the effects of fire in mineralizing nutrients, and that might not be really what you're getting at. But I think that you might get a small decrease in vigor as a result of damage to the upper level fine roots of the cypress trees, but probably not.
All right, thanks. I see that Mark has his hand raised. I wonder if we can enable his microphone. Mark may have just checked off. Oh, okay. Got any other questions?
Oh, I think I see I see a microphone by Mark now.
Hey, Mark, you want to go ahead and try to say your question aloud? We gave you microphone permission.
Maybe he needs to unmute his mic.
You might, Mark, you might need to go to the audio setup wizard under that little meeting button. I'm not sure if the microphones were just enabled. That might have to be done again. Yeah, maybe we can just take your question via the chat. Okay. I see it here. What is the opinion concerning the natural depths of organic soils and densities of pond cypress and habitats such as cypress domes? Well, just to touch briefly on the first point, the natural depths of organic soils, they are very thin at the edges of these cypress domes. Typically, and I'll just speak specifically about Big Cypress, but when you're going from an upland, say a pine flatwoods community toward a cypress dome, you'll begin to walk out of these pine rocklands that have extremely shallow soils or sandy soils overlying the limestone rock, and there will be just a very thin layer of organic soil at the outside, so just a few centimeters, a few inches. Toward the interiors of these cypress domes in southern Florida, it depends somewhat on the size of the cypress dome as to how deep the soils become, but I've seen organic soils going down to a couple of meters in one instance. Now those soils can be a lot thicker as you get into northern Florida, obviously into cypress swamps such as you have in the Okefenokee in Louisiana. They can be a good deal thicker than that. The densities of pond cypress are also highly variable. As you saw on those photos that I showed of the flooded cypress dome, it obviously does tend to be related somewhat to the tree size. You can have real thickets of your smaller size classes of cypress trees. They tend to thin out quite a good bit toward the interiors where the trees are really large. And I think that has some to do with competition, and I think it may have some to do with just the length of time that these trees live, being occasionally killed off by fire one by one toward the interiors of these domes. Now that just applies to the cypress domes. I think you might find a little bit different pattern of events in permanently flooded cypress swamps, with really large extents where you don't get fires, but maybe once a century or so. So hopefully that addresses the question.
Any other questions out there? Real quick, I got another question. Adam, you talked about the soil moisture in those monoliths. Did you extract the monoliths and then seal them all over to maintain the moisture level in it, or did you actually try to moisten them up in different ways before you started the smoldering test?
That's a good question. In a lot of studies, you do see that latter approach where people will pull particularly northern peat samples out, or sphagnum peat. I tried to keep the samples as close to field moisture content as I could. So I shopped around for what I think might be the world's largest Ziploc bags, and when we pulled the samples out, we double wrapped them in these giant thick Ziploc bags and put them on ice. And we did store them for a couple of months before we got around to burning them. So one of the, I guess, downsides or drawbacks to that could be that there might have been some migration in the moisture content from layer to layer, if you will. We did see that pretty big difference in the different strata of moisture contents, though. So I don't think that occurred too much, but I think that overall they do represent pretty well what the moisture contents were at the time. And I got some grab samples that we put in an oven right afterwards as well, and they agree pretty well.
All right, thanks. Any other questions?
I see, looks like Grant Steelman is submitting a question.
Got one coming in on there. Any others, or any of you who have microphones, if you've got some questions you'd like to ask and want to raise a hand, we'll see if we can get your mics turned on. Do you see that one, Adam?
I do. In the samples, did I record any temperature readings varying with the moisture content? And I'm pretty sure you probably mean temperature of the fire that occurred. No, unfortunately, we didn't. There have been some studies that have distributed thermocouples pretty widely throughout the samples. And make a long story short, I didn't want to risk disturbing the soil profile by inserting thermocouples. It would be interesting to see if there was a difference, though. One thing we know about smoldering combustion is that it proceeds in two different phases. If you have a nice tray of peat laid out and you set it on fire, smoldering on one side of the tray, you'll see these two smoldering fronts progress. There's a pyrolysis front and then there's a combustion front, and so it'll turn first black and then ashy gray. And we do know that depending on the moisture content, the speeds of those two fronts can differ. We also know, their rate of spread can differ. And I believe that it's been found that the temperature at that first pyrolysis front will vary slightly. But I think we can just assume that when the pyrolysis proceeds and the fuel is all dried out and ready for that second phase of smoldering, those temperatures in other studies tended to be pretty homogeneous. So probably, if I had to guess, I would say there's probably not a big difference in temperatures. I'd be glad to get the experiences of any of you who have done a lot of work with smoldering combustion or ground fires too, and hear you share your experiences. This is one set of studies in one place, but if you've got personal experiences, that'd be great to share. Okay, I see a question from Craig Iverson here. Has there been any study of the long-term accumulation or loss of organic matter in cypress domes, and is there a trend? That's another really good question. I think that intuitively you can expect that just based on the fact that there are these deep accumulations in some places of organic matter in cypress domes, there is accumulation. As far as the rate at which they accumulate, obviously that'll depend on how much water and how much time the water might be covering that area up and limiting decomposition. It's going to depend on nutrient factors. And another thing that's especially hard to get a handle on is it's going to depend on the fire history. One thing that's really problematic about a study such as that is if you've got a charcoal layer where you can say, okay, this was the last fire, you only really know that that represents the last fire. There might have been another fire before then that didn't burn as deeply, and your most recent fire might obliterate the record of that previous fire by going sort of blowing through that and consuming it. I know that there are a couple folks, Mike Ross at Florida International has been doing some studies on accumulation rates in tree islands, which are a pretty different ecosystem, but they're in the region. But I just don't know of any that look at the accumulation rate in cypress swamps. That would be really interesting to see, and I think you'd see a big trend probably depending on latitude or cypress dome size or cypress swamp size. Thanks.
All right, I see that we don't have any more questions coming in at this point, and the number's dropping a little bit, so I think we'll pull it to a close. And Adam, thank you again for the great presentation. Thank you all to you who are participating, and have sat through this. Craig is going to have one more quick question. And just one more quick reminder that we'll ask you all to thankfully respond to that real short evaluation that we'll send out via email. Craig says thanks too, and so on behalf of all of you, we thank you, Craig, and say goodbye to you. Have a great and safe weekend.
Thanks very much, everyone.